Beware of all the people who tell you they are enough. It's a sure sign that you're dealing with a fraud.
The television studio lights cast long shadows across the polished floor, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation. In churches across America, families gathered around their screens. In homes throughout Africa, entire communities huddled together, phones held high to catch every word. The world had paused, suspended in a moment of collective breath-holding, waiting for what many believed would be an unprecedented conversation. This was no ordinary interview. This was a collision of worlds, ideologies, and visions that had been brewing for decades beneath the surface of global consciousness. On one side of the elegantly appointed stage sat Bishop T.D. Jakes, a towering figure in the landscape of modern Christianity. His presence commanded attention, not through arrogance, but through the quiet authority that comes from decades of shepherding millions of souls. His silver hair caught the studio lights as he adjusted his notes, his weathered hands bearing the invisible weight of countless prayers, sermons, and late-night counseling sessions. Here was a man who had built an empire of faith, whose voice had echoed through megachurches, and whose books had transformed lives across continents. Across from him, separated by mere feet, but representing an ocean of cultural and ideological distance, sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré. At 34, he was young enough to be the bishop's son, yet his eyes held the gravity of someone who had witnessed history's darkest chapters and emerged determined to rewrite its future. The president of Burkina Faso carried himself with the quiet confidence of a revolutionary, not the theatrical kind that seeks attention, but the dangerous kind that moves mountains through sheer will and unwavering conviction. Traoré's military uniform was crisp but understated, bearing none of the ostentatious medals that often adorn the chests of African leaders. His youth was deceiving. This was a man who had already reshuffled the geopolitical deck in West Africa, challenging decades-old relationships with former colonial powers and daring to speak truths that made Western capitals uncomfortable. To some, he was Africa's brightest hope, a leader unafraid to break the chains of neocolonialism. To others, he was a dangerous radical whose rhetoric threatened the delicate balance of international relations. The stage itself seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. The production team had chosen a minimalist design: 2 chairs, a small table, and warm lighting that suggested intimacy rather than spectacle. This wasn't about flash or entertainment. This was about substance, about the collision of 2 worldviews that could reshape how millions understood faith, freedom, and the future of Africa. As cameras rolled and millions of viewers leaned forward in their seats, the atmosphere in the studio grew electric. Social media feeds were already buzzing with anticipation. Hashtags were prepared. Fingers hovered over share buttons, and pastors in their studies were already crafting responses to words that hadn't yet been spoken. Bishop Jakes, sensing the way of the moment, leaned forward with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to navigating delicate conversations. His voice, warm and resonant with the cadence that had made him one of America's most recognizable spiritual leaders, cut through the silence. President Traoré, he began, his tone carefully calibrated between respect and curiosity. I've been following your statements about Africa's future, your passionate calls for independence, your unwavering stance on breaking what you call the chains of foreign influence. Your dedication to your people's freedom is undeniable. It's moved hearts across the globe. He paused, allow his word to settle like dust after an explosion. But today, I want to venture beyond the realm of politics and governance. I want to explore something that touches the very core of human existence, something that has shaped civilizations and transformed countless lives throughout history. What is your perspective on Christianity? What does the message of Christ mean to you personally? And more importantly, what does it represent to the people of Burkina Faso? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the intersection of faith and revolution, of ancient beliefs and modern struggles. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the understanding that whatever came next would reverberate through churches, mosques, universities, and government halls around the world. President Traoré didn't rush to fill the silence. He understood the power of the pause, the weight that comes when a leader takes time to choose words that will be analyzed, quoted, and debated for years to come. He adjusted his microphone with deliberate care, his movements unhurried despite the intensity of thousands of eyes watching through screens across multiple continents. When he finally looked up, his gaze wasn't directed solely at Bishop Jakes. Instead, he looked directly into the camera lens, as if speaking to every individual viewer personally, to the grandmother in Ghana, the university student in Paris, the farmer in Mississippi, and the child in Lagos who might one day hear these words and have their worldview forever altered. "Bishop Jakes," he began, his voice carrying the quiet strength of deep conviction, "your question touches something that goes to the very heart of Africa's pain and Africa's hope. But before I answer, I need to share a truth that many prefer to whisper rather than proclaim." He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his expression intense. "Christianity is not foreign to Africa. This is the first lie that must be dismantled. Long before European ships appeared on our shores, long before missionaries carried Bibles across oceans, long before colonial administrators used religion as a tool of subjugation, Africa already walked with the Creator." His words gained momentum, each syllable carefully enunciated. "We already understood the sacred. We fasted during times of spiritual seeking. We gathered in communities to praise the Almighty. We had prophets who spoke divine truth to earthly power. We understood sacrifice, redemption, and the connection between the spiritual and physical worlds. What arrived later, what came with the ships, the guns, and the treaties, was not faith. It was control dressed in the robes of righteousness." Bishop Jakes raised an eyebrow, sensing that they were venturing into territory that would challenge comfortable assumptions. His extensive experience with interfaith dialogue told him that what was coming next would be profound, controversial, and impossible to ignore. President Traoré continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, like a river gaining power as it approaches the sea. "The Christianity that was imposed upon Africa was not the Christianity of Christ. It was the Christianity of conquest. It came with a Bible in one hand and instruments of oppression in the other. They preached, 'Blessed are the meek,' while they violently seized our lands. They taught, 'Love your enemies,' while they enslaved our children. They proclaimed, 'The truth shall set you free,' while they constructed elaborate systems to ensure our perpetual bondage." The studio audience, a carefully selected group of theologians, academics, and community leaders, shifted in their seats. Some nodded knowingly, recognizing truths they had long understood but rarely heard articulated so boldly. Others looked visibly uncomfortable, their faces reflecting the cognitive dissonance that comes when cherished beliefs collide with historical reality. "They told our ancestors to bow their heads in prayer, while colonial administrators lifted their heads to survey the wealth being extracted from our soil," Traoré continued, his finger tapping rhythmically against the table. "They said, 'Store up treasures in heaven,' while they stored up actual treasures in European banks. They preached about loving thy neighbor while they divided our communities, our families, our very identities." Bishop Jakes found himself leaning forward despite himself, recognizing prophetic tradition in Traoré's words, the same righteous anger that had once driven Jesus to overturn tables in the temple. "But here," Traoré said, his voice shifting to a tone of profound conviction, "is where I must be absolutely clear, because I will not allow my criticism of religious colonialism to be mistaken for a rejection of divine truth." He paused, allowing the weight of his next words to build like storm clouds on the horizon. "I do not reject Christianity. I reject the version of Christianity that was corrupted by politics, by greed, by the lust for power and control. I reject the Christianity that made peace with slavery, that blessed the theft of continents, that transformed the liberating message of Jesus into a tool for oppression." His voice rose not in anger, but in passionate conviction. Jesus Christ was not a colonizer. Jesus Christ was not an oppressor. Jesus Christ did not accumulate wealth while his followers suffered in poverty. Jesus Christ was a liberator. He stood with the poor, the marginalized, the despised, and forgotten. He challenged corrupt religious and political systems. He spoke truth to power even when it cost him everything. The president stood now, his presence filling the studio space as he gestured with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to addressing crowds and commanding attention. This is the Christianity that Africa must reclaim, not the Christianity of golden thrones and private jets, not the Christianity that tells the oppressor to be patient while never challenging the oppressor, but the Christianity of radical love, transformative justice, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. Bishop Jakes, recognizing a teachable moment, interjected with the skill of a master theologian. So you're suggesting, Mr. President, that what was practiced historically under the banner of Christianity was fundamentally inconsistent with Christ's actual teachings? Traoré's response was immediate and uncompromising. I'm not suggesting it, Bishop. I'm declaring it as historical fact. Christianity without justice is incomplete. Christianity that preaches salvation while ignoring systemic oppression is a hollow echo of Christ's message. Christianity that tells an enslaved person to obey their master while remaining silent about the master's need for repentance. That is not the faith that Jesus lived and died for. He returned to his seat, but his energy remained kinetic, electric. And this, he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper that somehow commanded more attention than shouting, is why Africa must experience resurrection, not just political liberation, but spiritual liberation. We must remove the chains not only from our lands and our economies, but from our minds, our hearts, and our understanding of the divine. The immediate response was explosive. Across social media platforms, hashtags began trending within minutes. Hashtag Traoré spoke, hashtag Christianity reclaimed, hashtag Truth and Faith, hashtag Africa Rising. Church WhatsApp groups erupted with voice messages debating his words. Seminary professors began crafting responses before the interview had even reached its halfway point. Cable news producers scrambled to book follow-up segments with theologians and Africa experts. But President Traoré was far from finished. He was just warming up, preparing to venture into theological territory that would challenge not just historical narratives, but contemporary Christian practice. In the book of Exodus, he continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a seasoned preacher despite his youth, we encounter one of the most powerful narratives in all of human literature. God liberates the children of Israel from Pharaoh's oppression. But this story, this magnificent story, is not merely historical documentation. It is prophetic literature. It is a template, a blueprint for every generation of oppressed people who cry out for freedom. Bishop Jakes found himself nodding almost involuntarily, recognizing the sophisticated theological framework underlying Traoré's argument. Africans today are not waiting for another Moses to emerge in the wilderness, the president declared, his voice gaining power like a gathering storm. We must be our own Moses. We must be the generation that says, let my people go to every modern-day pharaoh, whether that pharaoh wears a crown, a business suit, or hides behind the complex systems of economic exploitation that keep millions in bondage. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing with conviction. Faith without action is not just incomplete. It is a betrayal of everything that faith represents. Prayer without justice is not just powerless. It is hypocritical. If we truly believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if we truly believe in the Jesus who overturned tables in the temple, then we must stand against every pharaoh of our time, regardless of how they disguise their oppression. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Bishop Jakes, a man who had preached about liberation theology for decades, found himself witnessing it in its purest form. Not as academic theory, but as lived reality from a leader bearing the weight of an entire nation's hopes and struggles. You're calling the church to remember that the gospel has teeth, Bishop Jakes observed, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and challenge. Exactly, Traoré responded, his face lighting up with the recognition that he was being understood. The gospel is not a lullaby designed to keep the oppressed asleep. It is a wake-up call that demands transformation of both hearts and systems. Then, President Traoré turned toward Bishop Jakes with a directness that made the studio feel suddenly smaller, more intimate, as if the cameras had disappeared, and this was simply a conversation between two men grappling with eternal truths. Bishop, let me share something with you that will challenge not just your congregation, but every Christian leader who hears these words. The studio fell into a silence, so complete that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. If your preaching does not contribute to liberating the African child from hunger, if your church does not actively fight for the African farmer whose land is being stolen by multinational corporations, if your faith does not demand justice for the African mother who dies in childbirth because hospitals lack basic resources while billions are spent on weapons, then your Christianity is not Christianity. It is entertainment. and Africa has no more time for religious entertainment. The word struck like lightning. Gasps echoed through the studio audience. Some people began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Others sat frozen, their faces reflecting the discomfort that comes when comfortable beliefs are shattered by uncomfortable truths. We need truth that transforms. We need power that liberates. We need freedom that reaches beyond Sunday morning and into Monday's reality. If Christianity cannot speak to the everyday struggles of ordinary people, then it has failed in its most fundamental mission. Bishop Jakes found himself at a crossroads, not just in the interview, but in his understanding of ministry itself. Here was a young African leader challenging him to examine whether his decades of preaching had truly transformed lives or simply provided temporary comfort. "Mr. President," he said softly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that surprised even himself, "what then is Christianity to you? How do you define this faith that you're calling us to reclaim?" President Traoré's response was sharp, clear, and uncompromising. Christianity is not measured by the size of cathedrals or the grandeur of religious ceremonies. It is not defined by impressive titles or the wealth accumulated by religious leaders while their communities struggle with poverty. True Christianity, the Christianity of Christ, is measured by the power of love in action, the courage to speak truth regardless of consequences, and the unwavering demand for justice in every corner of human existence. He stood again, his passion evident in every gesture. If Christianity is not about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the imprisoned, caring for the sick, and standing with the marginalized, then it is not the Christianity that Jesus modeled. If it does not challenge systems that perpetuate inequality, if it does not speak prophetically to power, if it does not transform societies, then it is not the faith that turned the world upside down in the first century. The camera captured the faces of the audience, some with tears streaming down their cheeks, others shaking their heads in disbelief or disagreement. Theologians across the world were. Faith is not meant to be inherited like a family name or passed down like property. True faith, the kind that transforms lives and societies, must be consciously chosen, personally tested, and deliberately lived out through daily decisions and actions. His eyes moved between Bishop Jakes and the camera, acknowledging both his immediate conversation partner and his global audience. Too many of our people, not just here in Africa but throughout the world, carry Christianity as an identity marker rather than as a life philosophy. They can recite creeds and attend services. They can wear crosses and quote scriptures. But if you examine their daily interactions, their business practices, their treatment of those with less power, you will find very little evidence of Christ's actual influence in their lives. Bishop Jakes nodded thoughtfully, recognizing a theme he had wrestled with throughout his decades of ministry: the gap between professed faith and lived faith. "Tell me more about how you observe this in your role as president." Bishop Jakes encouraged, genuinely curious about the practical implications of faith from a governance perspective. President Traoré leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "In Burkina Faso, I see churches filled to capacity every Sunday morning. The singing is beautiful, the preaching is passionate, the atmosphere is electric with spiritual energy. But I don't measure the effectiveness of that spiritual energy by the volume of the music or the enthusiasm of the congregation." He gestured as if pointing beyond the studio walls to the streets outside. "I measure it by transformation that extends beyond the church building. On Monday morning, does the businessman who sang in the choir on Sunday treat his employees with greater dignity? Does the shopkeeper who testified about God's goodness on Sunday deal more honestly with his customers on Monday? Does the government official who raised their hands in worship on Sunday make decisions with greater integrity on Tuesday?" His voice gained intensity without becoming louder. If our Christianity does not fundamentally transform how we relate to each other in the marketplace, in our families, in our communities, and in our governance, then it is not Christianity as Jesus envisioned it. It is merely religion, and religion without transformation has never saved anyone from anything that truly matters. The profundity of this observation settled over the studio like morning mist. Bishop Jakes, who had spent his career challenging people to bring their faith into their daily lives, was hearing his message reflected back through the lens of a young leader burdened with the practical responsibility of governing an entire nation. "You're describing the integration of faith and life that Jesus modeled," Bishop Jakes observed. "Exactly," President Traoré responded, his face lighting up with a recognition that he was being understood at a deep level. When Jesus spoke in Matthew 25, he provided what I consider the ultimate test of authentic Christianity. He said, "When I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you visited me. When I was in prison, you came to me." He paused, allowing familiar words to resonate in their full power. Notice what Jesus did not say. He did not say, "When I was preaching, you applauded enthusiastically." He did not say, "When I was performing miracles, you posted about it on social media." He did not say, "When I was teaching, you took careful notes and could repeat my sermons word for word." His voice carried a note of gentle but unmistakable challenge. Jesus measured authentic faith by tangible acts of love, mercy, and justice. He evaluated discipleship based on how his followers treated the most vulnerable members of society. This is a standard that should measure the effectiveness of every church, every ministry, and every individual Christian. Bishop Jakes felt the weight of those words pressing against his own ministry and the broader Christian landscape he had been part of for decades. "You're saying that we have majored in the minors and minored in the majors," he said softly. A gentle smile crossed President Traoré's face, the smile of someone who has been deeply understood. "Yes, Bishop, exactly. And let me tell you why this matters so desperately for Africa, and indeed for Christianity everywhere." He stood and began to pace slowly, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. If Christianity is to survive and thrive in Africa, if it is to reclaim its power to transform lives and societies, it must return to its authentic roots. Not the roots established by colonial missionaries who often confuse European culture with Christian faith, but the roots of Jesus himself. His pacing stopped, and he turned to face Bishop Jakes directly. The Jesus who walked dusty roads among the poor. The Jesus who sat and ate with social outcasts. The Jesus who washed his disciples' feet when he could have demanded that they serve him. The Jesus who challenged corrupt religious authorities who had turned faith into a profitable enterprise. He stopped pacing and placed a gentle but firm hand on Bishop Jakes' shoulder. "Bishop, I want you to understand that I say these things not to condemn you personally or to attack faithful pastors who are genuinely trying to serve God. I speak these words because the world is watching us. People everywhere are asking a fundamental question. Can Christianity actually transform lives and societies, or is it just another system of power and control disguised in religious language?" His eyes reflected both urgency and hope. Our answer to that question, not just in our words but in our actions, will determine whether Christianity continues to be a force for genuine transformation in the world, or whether it becomes increasingly relevant to people facing real struggles and seeking authentic hope. Bishop Jakes felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. Throughout his career, he had counseled presidents, advised kings, and spoken to countless world leaders. But here was a man half his age speaking with the moral authority of an Old Testament prophet, challenging him to remember why he had first felt called to preach the gospel. When Bishop Jakes finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. President, you have shaken me to my core. You have reminded me of something I knew when I first began preaching, when I first felt the call of God on my life. I didn't start preaching for fame or recognition or financial success. I started because Jesus Christ had transformed my own life, and I wanted others to experience that same life-changing love." He paused, struggling to control his emotions. "But you're absolutely right. Somewhere along the way, not just me personally, but many of us in Christian leadership, we've lost something essential. We've allowed the machinery of ministry to become more important than the mission of ministry. We've permitted the success of our organizations to overshadow the purpose of those organizations." President Traoré nodded with both understanding and compassion. "Then let us commit together to help Christianity regain what it has lost. Let us teach people that following Jesus is not about Sunday morning entertainment, but about daily sacrifice for the benefit of others. Let us remind them that the cross was not made of gold or decorated with precious stones. It was made of rough wood, stained with blood, representing the ultimate sacrifice of love." His voice carried both challenge and hope. That kind of Christianity, the Christianity of sacrificial love, transformative justice, and unwavering commitment to marginalize, that is the faith that can save Africa. And that is the faith that can save the world. For several long moments, both men sat in contemplative silence. Outside the studio windows, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden light that seemed to fill the space with something approaching the sacred. It was as though the conversation had transcended the ordinary boundaries of political interview or religious discussion and had entered the realm of prophetic encounter. Finally, Bishop Jake stood and extended his hand to President Traoré, clasping it firmly with both of his own hands. Mr. President, I came here today thinking I would encourage and perhaps challenge you. Instead, you have ministered to me in ways that will change how I approach my calling for the rest of my life. I will carry this message back to my congregation, to my colleagues in ministry, and I will preach it until the day God calls me home. His voice carried the weight of renewed commitment. Christianity must return to Christ, not to the version of Christ that we've created to make ourselves comfortable, but to the Christ who makes us uncomfortable enough to change the world around us. President Traoré smiled with the warmth of someone who had been deeply understood. And when Christianity returns to its authentic roots, Bishop, the world will witness revival unlike anything it has seen in centuries. Not revival characterized by noise and spectacle, but revival characterized by love that transforms societies, justice that restores dignity to the oppressed, and truth that sets both individuals and communities free. The two men then did something that surprised everyone in the studio and watching around the world. Without any prompting from producers or direction from cameras, they knelt together in the center of the stage and prayed. It was not a polished, media-ready prayer designed to sound impressive to viewers. It was simple, heartfelt, and raw. Two men, one a preacher and the other a president, humbling themselves before the same God, asking not for wealth, fame, or power, but for the courage to live the gospel in its purest and most challenging form. As they rose from their knees, Bishop Jakes looked at President Traoré one final time and said, "You have fundamentally changed my understanding of what Christianity should be in the modern world." President Traoré replied softly, "Not I, Bishop. Christ himself has used this conversation to remind us both of truths we already knew, but had perhaps forgotten in the complexity of our respective responsibilities." And with those words, the interview concluded. But around the world, the conversation was just beginning. In seminary classrooms, professors would spend the next several weeks unpacking the theological implications of what they had witnessed. In churches across multiple continents, pastors would struggle with how to address the challenges raised by a young African president. In homes and communities, ordinary believers would wrestle with questions about the authenticity of their own faith and the effectiveness of their religious institutions. Some would dismiss President Traoré's words as the naive idealism of a young leader who didn't understand the complexities of modern Christianity. Others would embrace his message as a prophet,